The last slide you're pleased to know, but 1st of February 16, right to rent checks were brought in, which is the obligation on landlords to check the immigration status of prospective occupants. Again, criminal and financial penalties apply for non-compliance. And a couple of months ago, 1st of April 2018, these minimum energy efficiency standards were brought in, which restricted landlords from letting residential properties where the property had an F or a G energy performance rating. There are financial penalties for failing to comply with that, and there's also a name and shame policy as well for non-compliance. So that shows sort of really from you're starting in the very beginning with very heavily regulated tenancies. It became very easy when sort of buy-to-let market became very buoyant. It's now started to bring in more regulation over the last few years. We turn to the practical examples now. First one being rent arrears, and the second one being disrepair and retaliatory eviction. So rent arrears are a common problem. We deal with landlords every day who phone saying the tenant stopped paying the rent and what can we do to help. Landlords often feel reluctant to take immediate steps against tenants who are in arrears, believing they may settle the arrears quickly or that delay is simply a one-off. That hesitation can result in accrual of considerable arrears. The court process is not quick. We can be as efficient as we can with Stephen and the team, but the court does take several weeks to process paperwork, etc. And so if you leave it any period of time, the arrears will quickly rack up. The aim for a landlord really should be to obtain possession as quickly as possible in order to minimise financial losses by reletting their property to a reliable tenant. If your tenant's in 1 month's arrears, they miss one payment, speak to the tenant, try and find out what the situation is. If there's obviously a problem, they've not paid the rent. Most people pay their rent as their first expense before they pay anything else. Once the second month rent arrears has been hit, then it's time to start speaking to a solicitor, I think, and serving notice. There's obviously a real problem there that's not going to be sorted out. So once you've hit sort of your 2 months rent arrears, you have to serve a notice. That's the first thing to do, and it's a Section 8 notice. So you serve that notice. It's the only route that can be followed to enable a landlord to recover possession during that first term, 6 or 12 months most commonly. You can only use it where you've got a provision in your tenancy agreement for it to be brought to an end early on the grounds in question. And that's important. You get these people who have downloaded their tenancy agreement from Google somewhere. It's 2 pages, doesn't have all the right terms and conditions in it. If you haven't got that provision in there, if you've signed a 12-month tenancy, there's no ability to terminate the tenancy during that fixed term. You're not able to, the tenant can stop paying rent on day one, and you can't get a tenant out until the end of that 12-month term when that expires. So it's important you make sure you get your properly drafted tenancy agreements. You've got a number of grounds you rely on in your notice, and they're set out in the Housing Act. And so you've got your provision of the tenancy agreement. You rely on your grounds as set out in the Housing Act, and you serve the Section 8 notice. Must be in a prescribed form, set out the grounds that are relied upon, and explain why you're relying on each ground. So you serve that. And the grounds that I've been highlighted here, 8, 10 and 11 are the rent arrears grounds. So ground 8 is where there are substantial arrears of rent. If rent is payable monthly, substantial means 2 months. And if you can show to the judge at the date of service of your notice and at the date of the hearing there are at least 2 months arrears of rent, the judge is obliged to make a possession order. There's no discretion. If the rent drops down to 1 month at the date of the hearing, then you can rely on ground 10, and if the rent arrears are entirely cleared, you could also rely on ground 11, which is to say there's been persistent delay in paying rent. Those are discretionary grounds, so even if you're able to show to the judge there are some arrears, the judge weighs up the circumstances and makes a decision, so you can't be certain. Unpaid rent is the most common reason for termination during a fixed term. Yes, and I say it's at the bottom, it's 10 and 11, if proved, the court only makes an order if it's reasonable to do so. A flow chart here really just shows how these times, these weeks sort of pass by. So box 1 is your monthly rent of 2 months, they're the arrears. You serve your Section 8 notice, issue your possession proceedings in the county court, You then have a hearing 4 to 6 weeks after you've issued the possession proceedings. You go along, you ask the judge to make the possession order. The judge hopefully makes the possession order. The tenant is given 14 days to vacate. You then need to apply for a bailiff if the tenant doesn't vacate, and then that's 4 to 5 weeks after you make your request for the bailiff. So total could be 12 to 16 weeks. And obviously if they're not paying rent during that time, it does quickly rack up. Second example is disrepair and retaliatory evictions. Some of you who rented property 10, 15 years ago, if you've a tenant that complained about the condition of the property, some landlords would say, we'll simply serve a Section 21 notice, and there would be no defence to that. You could do that, the tenant would go, and you bring in a new tenant who would be happy with the condition. The landlord does have obviously various statutory and other repairing obligations, structure of the building, hygienic facilities, heating and hot water supply. Any tenancies created after the 1st of October 15, when a written complaint about the condition of the property has been received, the landlord now must investigate the complaint and provide a detailed response to the complaint within 14 days. The response must set out the description of the action the landlord proposes to take and a reasonable timescale within which that action will be taken. The rules are brought in October 15 say that it prevents the landlord from serving a Section 21 notice where the tenant has requested repairs are carried out to the property. The notice will become invalid where the following 3 rules apply. The tenant's made a written complaint to the landlord concerning the condition of the premises. The landlord's failed to reply or gives an inadequate reply, and then the local authority issues an improvement notice. If that improvement notice is served by the council, no Section 21 notice may be served for a period of 6 months from the date of service of that improvement notice. A couple of exemptions. Where the premises are genuinely on the market for sale, the tenant doesn't use the premises in a tenant-like manner, so it's the tenant's fault, but I've queried their practical problem with that, sometimes damp, and the responsibility to put that right. And it's also exempt, it was an exemption where the Section 21 notice is served before a complaint is made by the tenant to the landlord. So the order must be a complaint by the tenant, then a notice. If you serve your notice first, then the tenant complains, then it's not a retaliatory eviction, so the rules don't apply. So conclusion really is that this, I see in terms of going forward, the trend for this increased regulation is going to continue. The tenant fee ban, which some of you may have heard about in the news, is going through Parliament at the moment. That's going to ban a range of fees that tenants can be charged, both for letting agents and also for landlords. It'll ban credit checks, inventories, administration charges, those sorts of things. It'll also limit security deposits to 6 weeks' rent, and there's financial penalties apply for non-compliance. The other theme I think running through all this is that what's coupled with the increased regulation is there are financial and criminal penalties for non-compliance, and they're all attached to these sorts of rules and restrictions that have been brought in. The minimum energy efficiency standards, which I've touched upon, prevent the letting of properties with an F or a G, but it's inevitable that at some stage that will be increased to include E and upwards, etc. Those of you who have HMOs are going to be subjected to more onerous conditions as well, so there'll be minimum usable floor space areas, for example. And Shelter, who are constantly lobbying the government to bring in new measures in favour of tenants. They're lobbying the government currently to introduce tenancies with a minimum 5-year term. So I think that's the point I want to leave you with, really, which is this regulation is is continuing, certainly going forward. The key to compliance is good record keeping, so making sure you've got evidence that you're complying with all these various rules. Ensure that any tenant complaints are properly investigated. If it's a completely meritless complaint, it can be ignored, but you need to investigate it. It's essential to have a good letting or managing agent looking after matters. It would be easy for me to say that looking at Stephen, that suggested you use Stephen, but it's important. You do need to have a letting agent, really. If you're doing it full time, you're really up to date. It's very easy to trip up, and I have landlords coming all the time saying, I've not protected the deposit or whatever rule they've not complied with, and it makes it more difficult to get the tenant out. Non-compliance will expose landlords to financial, as I say, in some cases criminal sanctions, and non-compliance is also prevent a landlord from being able to recover possession. There's a link between the Section 21 notice and the landlord's ability to rely on that and compliance with these rules. If you don't comply with the rules, quite often you're not going to be able to rely on a Section 21 notice. So that's me. So yeah, that's me, Joe Bryant. My colleague Craig at the back here works with me as well, and we're down in Chelmsford office just through the door. So there we go. I'm up for time, I think. Thank you.